We have a very exciting panel today. Let me introduce the three panelists, and then I'll ask them to each say a little bit about themselves and their focus and the like. So first we have Darshana Zaveri, who's managing partner at Catalyst Health Ventures. We have Lily Lyman, a partner at Underscore VC, and Deepak Verma, a partner at InnoSpark Ventures. Darshana, would you like to say a little bit about you and your practice?
Sure. Thanks, David. Thanks for moderating, and thank you also to Simone and Anu and TiE for putting this event together. So I'm a managing partner at Catalyst Health Ventures. We are a healthcare-focused fund based in Boston. We have been investing for about 12 years now, and specifically within healthcare, we focus on medical technologies. So that's about 80% medical devices, some diagnostics, some diagnostic tools, and some digital health. So that's our focus. We're now investing out of our new fund. We tend to, in terms of sort of deals that we look for a lead position. We typically take a board position and a lead position where we're comfortable investing by ourselves or with a syndicate. And we're pretty early stage, meaning we like to see some proof of concept, but it can be animal data, it can be preclinical. And we like to typically be the first institutional investor in a company.
Great. Lily?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Lily. I'm a partner at Underscore VC. We are a community-driven venture firm based here in Boston. We focus on early stage, so seed and Series A. We focus on B2B software, and we invest with a Boston bias. We're particularly bullish on what's going on here in this ecosystem. And what I mean by community-driven is the founding premise of the firm is that what really moves the needle in building the next iconic company is surrounding founders with the right people at the right time. And so what we've done is built up a network of experts that are curated by domain, by stage, by function to surround our portfolio companies with. And we engage them in a way where they actually have some skin in the game and have some real investment. And so it's a non-dilutive to founders. And so it's a win-win-win, but we're particularly excited about broadly building the ecosystem here in Boston and host a series of events and things like that. Some areas that I personally, my background's as a founder and an operator. I was out on the West Coast for several years. I was at Facebook in a product strategy role as part of the growth organization. I personally spent a lot of my time at Underscore in digital transformation, so sort of sleepy industries that are getting digitized and intelligence brought to them, and then also future of work. But as a firm, we're also spending a lot of time in Fintech as a broader area, and then also cloud infrastructure. So thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Great. Deepak?
Thank you, David. And thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me here. I'm Deepak Verma. I'm with InnoSpark Ventures, and we're a relatively young fund, a little over 2 years now. And we like to invest in companies that are using AI and ML in really unique and defensible and differentiated ways to solve really hard problems. And so we start with our AI mandate, and then that takes us into different domains. And in our 2 years, a little over 2 years, we've done about 16 or 17 investments. A lot of them are in healthcare and in life sciences. And then several of them are in the B2B services kind of space. And we like to come in early. We like to be the first institutional money in, although we don't have to be. So we do seed to Series A, typically. And we love to reserve some of our capital for future rounds, and we like to stay in not just for a little bit of time, but through the entire journey of the entrepreneur. I should point out that we're not a fund that has raised money from other sources, so we operate more like a family fund. What that does is it allows us to have patient capital. And we're not under the typical pressures of needing to return capital to our limited investors because we don't have any. So that's us. And again, good to be here.
Terrific. Thank you all. So I'm going to start off asking the panelists questions, and then in a bit, we'll turn it over to the folks in the audience, and Simone will look to the audience to ask questions in the second part of today's panel. So this is an Outlook forum, but in order to look forward, we all have to look back and see the lessons we've learned. And we all have, and we continue to live in a pandemic. So the first series of questions are going to be lessons learned over the last 12 months or so. So Lily, first question for you. How has the pandemic impacted your portfolio companies generally in your overall involvement at the investor and board level? And what lessons have you learned? What changes are likely to continue when we get back to quote unquote normal times?
Yeah, it's an important question, I think. And what's interesting is to see how it's evolved over the past 10 months. And so I think, when March first set in, there were a couple of themes that we worked very closely with our portfolio companies on in terms of how to look ahead and how to manage a phrase we found ourselves saying a lot was the only thing that's certain is uncertainty. And I think that's been a theme for this year in general. And so what that meant very practically is we spent a lot of time in March and April and May with our portfolio companies thinking about one is cash preservation. The financing market was unclear. And so we, advise companies to think about what can you do to give yourself 18 months of runway of cash. And so, I think what we saw, there's a lot of companies take very hard decisions. And I just have so much deep respect for founders and entrepreneurs who had to quickly make decisions. I think those who meddled or waited too long actually were in a worse position than those who took hard decisions quickly and decisively. So cash was one sort of initial theme that we worked very closely with companies on. I think the second one was around team and people and making hard decisions on how you're managing your team. How can you make sure you can keep the best assets that you have, which is, your human capital. And it takes a lot of time and effort to get the right people around the table. And some companies had to be creative about how to do that and how to keep people and things like that. And then I think there's a theme that arises in that we are living with today and will continue to live with, which is a theme around sort of culture and empathy and understanding what's going on. Darcy and I were just talking about not having a nanny and what does that mean and what's going on in the background and the dogs and the babies and all the things that, we're seeing a more human side of people. But I think that's caused founders and leaders to really think about how do I, what kind of environment am I creating for my team? How do I preserve culture over the distance and remote learning? How do I make these hires from a remote perspective? And I think those are some of the themes and lessons that we've learned over the last year and that will carry forward. As we look ahead, I think we will be facing a hybrid model. I think it'll be a spectrum and we can maybe have a longer conversation on that. But that is a theme that is here to stay. A third bucket that we worked with our portfolio companies on was customers. And I think customer retention became incredibly important when the pandemic first set on. We sort of had a mantra around hug your customers, treat them like prospects. Because it was uncertain what new sales would look like, who would have budgets. And of course, this varied by industry, but I think in the B2B SaaS world, that was very true. And so I actually think it put a good customer centricity within a lot of our portfolio companies that I think is a best practice that will persist. And we spent a lot of time thinking about how do you become more customer centric? How do you work cross-functionally, not just customer success team, but to make sure that your customers are surviving and thriving, because that will be your most attainable source of revenue in these times of uncertainty. And then, finally, I think the piece of financing. We had a couple of portfolio companies that were going to go out and raise rounds in June. And, that quickly became a new strategy, a new plan. And it was unclear what the financing outlook would look like for the year. And I think, and so thinking about that relates to the cash piece, but also I think we had a hypothesis, which has come true, which is if you are a standout company, there will be financing for you. But if you're not, it might be harder. And I think at the earlier stages that has been true. I mean, the number of deals that were funded at sort of the seed stage this year has dropped. There's still a ton of capital being deployed, but I think you're seeing it more at the later stages. And we can talk about some of that data. But So those are some of the big themes that we had big conversations on, both in the boardroom as the advisor level with our portfolio companies, and looking across our portfolio. I mean, we did sort of a scorecard across everybody to say who would, who's in great shape and will thrive in this environment, who can buckle down and ride it out, and then who might be in trouble and what are we going to do about that. So those are some of the themes. I think there's a lot of lessons learned. I think particularly on the team and people side. On the culture side, on building organizations that will persist, and then also, as I said, this customer centricity is something that I think will carry forward.
Great. Darshana, would you like to give some thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I'll add a few elements to this conversation, and I loved Lily's answer. I mean, particularly the idea of how this started in March and where we have come over 10 months and the best practices actually that have evolved out of this really tough situation, which I'm actually amazed by. So I think, for us, we are a med tech firm, right? So all of our companies are producing devices that are used in hospitals or outpatient settings. And what that means is we need doctors, we need clinicians to be available to do these procedures. We need nurses, we need operating rooms, we need patients to be willing to come to those settings. And as we know, most patients have been unwilling to go to healthcare settings. So COVID, when this first hit us, we certainly expected to have all of our portfolio companies have a major hit in terms of whether they were in clinical trials or they were commercial. We expected them to have big problems enrolling patients or selling devices. And some of that certainly happened. We did have delays. I would say by and large, there was about a 3 to 4 month delay in terms of patient enrollment. And so, what goes with that is, us telling our portfolio companies, let's preserve capital. Let's just make sure we can get through to the other side and treat the number of patients that we need to treat in order to raise the next round of capital and reach our value inflection points. But as time went by, certainly we were amazed at just the sheer creativity of our portfolio companies. They went to treat patients wherever in the world they could. They went to New Zealand, they went to Paraguay, they went to Georgia. They found new places. They rented an aircraft and just made it there. And so, I just think making sure you have teams that are ingenuous enough to kind of, make it through this completely unusual time is just such an important thing. The few commercial companies that we had ended up being about 75 to 80% of their revenue target, which again was amazing to me. And part of the reason they were able to do that is because almost all of them started doing remote training for physicians. And so, here's where the digital element comes in. And, we don't necessarily involve in or invest in technologies that are digital of that nature, but I can see how it impacts our portfolio and healthcare in general. And I think that is definitely a best practice that has emerged out of this, which is in the future, I don't see a need, and most of our portfolio companies don't see a need to go on site to train physicians. They can do it remotely. And that saves a lot of capital, a lot of cost. So I really think it's a tale of two cities, a lot of learnings and some delays and some impact to the portfolio, but other side, I think everybody is coming out stronger from this situation. And I think personally, one other lesson for me as a venture investor has been, we can do deals in this environment. We did 3 deals last year. Not having gone on site for diligence. Those companies are performing well. And we're actually about to do a deal possibly in the next 2 months where it's probably the first company in 12 years that we would invest in without ever meeting the founders. And so I think things are changing, but in a positive way.
Okay. Deepak, any thoughts on your end?
Sure, but you put me after 2 giants, so I'm not sure how much more I can add. But a couple of thoughts. So I do agree with a lot of the themes that Lily, you, and Darshana have spoken about. What I would add is we also early in the pandemic spent a lot of time with our company saying, okay, what the hell does this mean? What do you need to do? focus, prioritize, get rid of everything that isn't important, conserve cash, extend runway, all of that stuff, right? But I actually think that there's such value in having to have gone through that process for our companies. And now you think about how they are now, and they're so much more conscious about what they're spending on, and is it critical, and is it necessary, and do we need to do it today, or can we postpone it and do that later because it's not on the critical path? And that operational discipline, I think, is something that's going to become part of the fundamental character of these companies, or at least many of them, as they move forward. And so I think that's a great thing. The second thing I'll just call out quickly is, at least as we looked at our companies, some of them weren't really impacted from a market perspective because they were either pre-revenue or they were doing a lot of fundamental research, building the science, but some were. And some of our companies were selling into education, K through 12, and we know kind of what happened with that. Some were selling into the hospitality space. And so some of them had to go through this period of not only conserving cash, but saying, okay, our core market's gone, now what do we do? And so we had some that pivoted and found new opportunities and then targeted new opportunities. And frankly, the pandemic also created some opportunities. So while healthcare, I think in general health providers got really kind of adversely impacted because they were A, focused on COVID, and B, none of the other stuff. There were some emergency response kind of opportunities that came up that some of our companies really jumped on and were able to really support some of the efforts going on. So I agree that this was, it was like a trial by fire, right? If you can survive this, you can deal with anything after this kind of thing. And so from that perspective, it was hard initially, but it's turned out net positive for most of the portfolio.
Okay. That's great, and appreciate all the impact. Darshan, I'm going to turn the question around to you and ask how the pandemic impacted your search for new companies, your general investment activities, criteria, how you evaluated portfolio companies and the like. You mentioned you closed a couple deals this past year. Tell us, what's changed in the investment approach.
Sure. So I would say, by and large, nothing. We have a strategy, which is to invest in medical devices and diagnostics, and we have pretty much stayed true to that strategy. What we have seen in terms of deals, and I'm sure everybody on this panel knows we see over 1,000 deals a year. We certainly saw a lot more deals that had some sort of COVID-related innovation associated with it. So if we just did a search of the word COVID in our deal database, we'd find a lot more last year. Obviously, we'd find a lot more last year, but a huge number of companies came to us with that theme, sort of is it whether it was a diagnostic or a therapeutic or something related to COVID. We did not make an investment in any of those companies, and not because we were averse to it, but just because we didn't see anything that was that unique or differentiated. So in terms of what we started seeing, I think the pandemic did have an effect of kind of seeing all these companies that were doing more and more diagnostics, or at least using the theme to kind of elaborate on their value proposition. But in terms of what we invested in, we are very focused on cardiology and oncology. If you think about the sort of the biggest killers in the world today, I mean, those are the two big disease states that impact the world, and we've always been very focused on those. And even within that, we're very focused on therapeutic medical devices, so where devices can play a role in actual therapy or massively improving clinical outcomes, and that's where we kind of stayed true. So that was our experience. We obviously, the way we interact, and I mentioned this earlier, the way we interact with companies changed pretty dramatically in the last year. We did everything online, everything by Zoom. We did a ton of diligence and closed 3 transactions, and that involved many hours of Zoom calls and Zoom meetings, but we found that we were actually able to be fairly efficient in terms of getting everything done and closing the transactions. So that was my experience. I don't think at least our philosophy is not to sort of chase something that is very topical or temporal. And so we're just going to stick with what we know best.
Terrific. Deepak?
Yeah, so as I think about kind of sourcing and new opportunities, and I compare 2019 to 2020. I mean, so most of last year was COVID times. We saw maybe about 300 opportunities in the year before COVID, and last year we saw about 600. So certainly, well, part of it was we're a young fund, and we're probably getting a little bit better in terms of plugging into different channels of sourcing and all of that. But I don't think that the pandemic impacted kind of entrepreneurial spirit and creation of companies. I do think in the first part of COVID times, so in the first half of last year, we saw a lot of stuff that I think was very early, not fully developed, or somewhat, situations where people were a little desperate and looking for money urgently to keep the doors open and stuff like that. But later in the year, we started seeing some really good companies. One thing that COVID absolutely did for us, and Lily, like Underscore, we are very much Boston focused. We're committed to the Boston ecosystem. We like to invest in Boston companies. But what COVID has allowed us to do is to go broader in terms of geography on a selective basis. But because you're doing, it doesn't matter whether the founder is sitting 2 miles away or 2,000 miles away, right? And so we've invested in our first non-Boston companies now, actually recently. And we've done about 4 deals so far where we've never ever shaken hands with the founders, never had a physical drink or dinner with them. And I sometimes wonder, I mean, how much are we giving up in terms of really understanding the full picture? But you have to go with the flow, I guess, right? So I think I don't think it's in terms of how we approach opportunities that we've changed a lot, as in, well, we're evolving ourselves. We're learning more about ourselves. We're learning about what works. So that evolution is happening. But as I think about COVID, but it has absolutely impacted how many opportunities come to the finish line. So we did about 15 opportunities in the 1.5 years before COVID, and since then we've done 4. So the number of deals reaching the finish line has certainly gone down.
Okay, thank you, Lily. Follow-up question to that. What trends did you see in 2020 and that you'll think will continue as we head into the new year?
Yeah, I think there will be a lot in terms of if the questions are on sort of investment areas or spaces that we're excited about. I think digital transformation is indeed a sort of a buzzword, but I do think, there's memes going around in terms of what drove digital transformation of your company. Was it your CEO, your CIO, or COVID? And I think that, the force to remote work actually did sort of force a lot of industries that had resisted perhaps digitizing pieces of their workflow. Now we're forced to and figure out how to work synchronously and asynchronously. So I think that it wasn't necessarily new for a lot of these industries, whether it's, we invested in insurance, looking at construction, manufacturing. But I think that those have definitely accelerated. And I think that acceleration has been a good catalyst and will continue. I think, this is much more Darshan's world, but the world of telemedicine and telehealth and some of that, has forced some regulation changes that I think ultimately will persist and have opened up the world of opportunities in that space as well. Similarly, I think in the world of education, ed tech, that saw some tailwinds that I think will continue. And then, we have, prior to COVID, we had actually made a fair number of investments in the future of workspace in a couple of different dimensions. We've made a couple investments in employee engagement and management, a company called Hello Team here in Boston, and another one called Friday. Both fall into that space. I think that has become increasingly important and challenging as founders and executive teams figure out how to manage a distributed workforce. So I think we'll see more innovation in that space, but you also are seeing more noise. So I think we'll be weeding through the noise. We actually, prior to COVID, had made an investment in the video collaboration space, a company called Macro that came out of Harvard. I think we're seeing more and more of the verticalization of Zoom, bundling, unbundling of Zoom, if you will. I think we'll continue to see some interesting things in that space, although again, increasingly crowded. So it's around what will really stick. I think there'll be some platform plays in the future of workspace around managing payroll, compliance, benefits, things like that, taxes, as people figure out how to manage these evolving workforces. So that's an area that we're paying attention to as well. Cloud infrastructure is another area that I think is, we've again pre-COVID looked at and continue to think that it will be interesting. There's a company called Cloud Zero in our portfolio company that helps companies manage their cost of their cloud spend, which obviously come April, May was a very important line item in people's budgets that they're looking at and figuring out how to manage. So that's a large amount of tailwinds, and I think that will continue to spend to be relevant. Fintech, I feel like it's the buzzword of the year, and I think if we said everything was a SaaS, becoming a SaaS company, now people talk about everything's becoming a fintech company. There's a lot of opportunity there in terms of embedded finance infrastructure, insurtech, and it can mean lots of different things. But it's an area that we brought on a new partner, a fellow named Chris Gardner, who is a founder of TiE and an exec at PayPal, and he's leading the charge for us in that space. So that was a lot of different things, but I think the way we work is changing. I think digitization of quote unquote sleepy industries will change how people do their workflow and how do they add data to that. Deskless workforce is still a huge untapped opportunity that we're spending time in, and then in the fintech world.
Great. Deepak, I'm going to give you an opportunity to brag a little bit. Tell us about one or two deals that you closed in 2020 and what excited you about the new portfolio companies.
Sure. We only closed very few deals, so it's not that hard to pick which ones. But let me tell you about a couple that we're all very excited about. The first is a company called Encore, and this is four young adults who recently graduated from college, MIT, all engineers, came together and they created this wearable, which what it does is it senses the tremor in your arm, and whether it's a Parkinson's tremor or an essential tremor, and it figures out the amplitude and the frequency and the waveform, and then it generates an anti-signal, a noise canceling signal through vibrators, which then vibrate and it stabilizes your tremor. So very simple, straightforward application, but and the company is very young. We were the first institutional money in, but they've got some anecdotal data with some patients that it works, and now they're getting ready to do their first clinical trials. So, and then the interesting thing is, if you think about this, this is a symptomatic treatment. However, if you actually dig into neuroscience and look at things like entrainment and training the brain, there is a potentially down the road therapeutic angle to this as well, which is incredibly exciting. And what I find interesting is almost everybody that they've talked to, whether it's potential clinical partners, investors, everybody has a personal connection because this is something that hits so close to home that people can relate to it. And anyway, so that's a company that we're really excited about. And then there's a second company, which shall remain nameless for the moment, but I can tell you a little bit about what they do. They have created this, it's like a microscope that uses fluorescent lighting to detect embryo health in IVF, in an IVF context. And so what they would be able to do is really advise doctors which of the several embryos that have fertilized would be the best to implant. And again, I mean, there's so much pain in that cycle of IVF, and I've experienced that, me and my wife, many years ago, and I'm sure, I mean, there are a lot of people, of course, who are going through this, but if you can actually shorten the cycle, figure out more quickly whether the embryo that is going to be implanted is healthy enough, and which out of the several is the right one to pick. That can have pretty significant impact. Again, early stage and about to start clinical trials in the next month or two. So both of these were deals that we did last year.
Lily, how about you?
Yeah, so there's a couple. We've actually had one of our busiest years. We made 16 new investments this past year. So in terms of, yeah, it's been interesting. So if you think about sort of deal flow slowing down or speeding up, I think we've definitely we've had a busy year. And to Deepak's point, I think over half of those are folks that we've never met in person. So it's certainly been an adjustment. I'll speak to a couple others. There's one called a company called Hi Marley, which we've invested in. We actually invested in sort of prior to this year, but just closed another round, which is a communication platform for insurance. So it's a text-based solution that, think if a tree falls on your house, you can text your claims agent and get it processed much faster. But it's a great example of a consumer experience trend in terms of people wanting to text and communicate with different actors in their life in a way that can have meaningful impact on how quickly insurance companies can process their claims and how they manage their customer experience. And it's just a phenomenal team building here in Boston. So we've actually just co-invested in their Series B, which will be announced shortly. But so that's one I remain excited about. Part of it is the huge opportunity in the insurance space, and part of it is just a great team in terms of how they're building. They're very thoughtful about their culture and attracting great talent, and also bullish on Boston. So that's one that I'm particularly excited about. I'm trying to think which other ones are announced. There's one in a space that I think is interesting that I didn't really talk about, but is sort of verticalizing workflow. There's a company that we just invested in that helps manage recruiting, credentialing, and placement of nurses in particular. And it's an example of a workflow that was just very broken and fragmented for how health providers found, recruited, onboarded nurses into their system. And I think they've seen a big uptick this year, a lot of opportunity, and just creating a better experience both for the end users and greatly optimizing the workflow for the recruiters. And then on top of it, they're creating a really interesting data set in terms of backgrounds, criteria, professional histories, and things like that for a very specific segment in the nurse population. So that's one that I think is interesting and I'm excited about as well. But there's a lot to talk about. So those are two examples.
Ashana, would you like to talk about any new additions to your portfolio companies?
Sure. Yeah, other end of the spectrum from Lily, we do very few deals a year, but we make highly concentrated bets. So we did 3 transactions last year that were our first investment into the company, and we also did a couple of follow-ons. And so this is from our new portfolio. And as it turns out, we do usually like to be the first institutional capital in a company, but we are also pretty flexible. And as it turns out, the companies that we invested in last year were all sort of Series B rounds. So a slightly later stage than what we typically do for a first check. And they were also larger rounds. So they were, $25 million rounds that we co-led at the Series B stage. So I'll describe a couple of them, maybe one that we did, which was a first investment for us. It's a company based out of Orange County in California. And it's a pacemaker that never goes into the veins of the heart. So, everybody's familiar with pacemakers, been around for 100 years. People are asking, why do you need innovation in pacemakers? Well, it turns out that, it's once you get a pacemaker into the heart, it sort of grows in and stays there. If you ever need to remove it, it's quite a dangerous procedure and has a certain amount of mortality associated with it. And also, there are increasing number of sort of transcatheter procedures today, like valve replacements and other things where patients need temporal pacing. So while the procedure is going on, then their heart needs to be paced. And so this is a device that goes just subcutaneously, so not into the heart, and it takes 5 minutes to put it in and take it out. And the patient can be mobile. Right after the procedure, they can be mobile, they can go home, they can be discharged, they can have this temporary pacemaker in for a period of 30 days, come back to the hospital once they get their normal heartbeat back. You can just take it off. Or you can make the decision to, the heartbeat never comes back to normal and you need to you have a permanent implant, and now you already got it in there. So there's no need for something else that actually goes into the heart and the veins. So beyond that, there are many other value propositions for the device, but I won't go into that. But a really exciting technology that they already had a few humans done, and they're now about to start their pivotal trial that will get them through approval. And then another company that we were the Series B lead, and then we participated in the Series C, which ended up being a much bigger $75 million round, is a company called Conformal Medical, which is right around here that's out of Dartmouth in New Hampshire. And that company is essentially, it's a device that plugs a hole in the heart that causes stroke in a certain patient population. So the patient population has something called atrial fibrillation, which is basically irregular heartbeat. These patients have blood clots that form in this opening in the heart called the left atrial appendage, and then travel to the brain and cause stroke. So it's again, very high mortality and a big risk for these patients. And what this company does is it's a device that essentially closes the hole off. It's just, you put it in there, tissue grows over it, you've eliminated the site of clot formation. So very exciting company, and they're about to start their pivotal trial as well, with fantastic data from the first trial. Now they're about to start their final and PMA trial and get to approval. That's a flavor of what we do.
Terrific. Darshana, I'm going to stick with you. So looking ahead, obviously we have a new administration down in Washington. What do you expect will be the impact of the Biden administration? I know your practice is, in the healthcare medical device, so regulatory action obviously is going to impact what your investments and portfolio and like. But talk to us a little bit about what you see the Biden administration's impact on the VC community.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I will say first off that, from the perspective of healthcare investors, every subsequent administration has been by and large favorable. And the reason I say that is because, you could view the Affordable Care Act in a positive or a negative way, but certainly, there is the potential to now treat a lot more patients. Your patient pool increases pretty dramatically if everybody has insurance. What I would say specifically about the Biden administration is that I'm hoping that there will be more certainty and less uncertainty. And so I think investors like certainty, whether they like a particular regulatory framework or not. At least you can plan for it if you know that's what it's going to be for 5 years or 10 years, as opposed to sort of messages that are inconsistent or you don't really know how to plan for it. So I think that's one thing that I think this particular administration is going to help with. But overall, as I said, I think investing in healthcare, particularly in medical devices, has been improving with each subsequent administration. The FDA has become far easier to work with, much more collaborative. Our companies are engaging with them far sooner than they used to. And the FDA is giving them a lot more sort of direction and certainty around the regulatory path. Again, investors like certainty. Mm-hmm. And then there's a couple of very specific things that have happened in the last, I'll say, couple of years that are very beneficial to the medtech sector. One is that the FDA now has something called a breakthrough device designation, which is meant for devices that are therapeutic in nature and address very high unmet needs. And what that gives you is a shorter regulatory path, a more secure or certain regulatory path. as well as reimbursement coverage, so payer coverage for the first 4 years after a device is approved. And that is huge, because one of the biggest risks that we take as medtech investors is that PMA trial and reimbursement. How do you get paid for what you're doing? And this just gives all of these companies so much more certainty around that process. So I think, overall, very positive, but we'll see. We haven't heard anything definitive yet, so.
Okay. Deepak, any thoughts on your end?
Yeah. So agree with what Darshana said. I also expect, given the administration's emphasis on climate, that there'll be kind of an improved investment climate for clean tech, perhaps for ag tech, and certainly I think the emphasis on life sciences will continue, and your NIH non-dilutive funding and other sources of non-dilutive funding should, stay the same or get better, I think, but certainly not head in the other direction. In terms of potential adverse impact, I can think of kind of how the forces are lining up in some cases against big tech, right? And the conversations around anti-competitive regulations, privacy, data protection, taxes. I think some companies that are probably in some of the crosshairs are companies like Amazon and Facebook. What does that do for exits and size of exits and IPOs? Does it have a somewhat cooling effect or not down the road? I mean, it's a question from my side, not a prediction, but I do think we may see some of that. Yeah, and one point of Darshana that I'll just pick up on specifically is the increased coverage, I think, and the work that the FDA has done has actually been pretty amazing, but I see that only continuing to get better. So I think the FDA will continue to get better, easier to work with. I think coverage from ACA and the CMS, Medicare, Medicaid, all of that should continue to strengthen, and that's good for, I think, healthcare businesses, certainly.
Okay. Lily?
Yeah, the only two things I'd add on this one, I think a positive that we can see is sort of the impact on immigration and visa policies, which I think do have a big impact on the startup community across the board, and also big tech, but also for students who are looking to stay here and founders coming out of the academic institutions. So I think that's a positive. And then another area that I'm curious about and not that knowledgeable about, I will name it, but I think I think where the world is going from climate policy perspective, I think opens up some opportunities, and you're seeing some venture community pockets start to respond to that. So, USV just announced a separate fund for climate investments in particular. So I think, back to the point of at least there's some certainty or consistency. I think you see people gearing up to make another wave of bets in this space. And I think perhaps you could argue that the market's evolved a bit. So there'll be some interesting things coming up there.
Okay, terrific. Lily, I'm going to stick with you and switch topics a little bit. What do you do? What does your firm do when you personally to promote diversity and inclusion within your firm, your investment, and how does that impact your investment strategy, and how a little bit about DEI at the portfolio level?
Yeah. It's such an important topic. It's one I'm personally very passionate about. As a firm, we're very passionate about it, and such an important one for the industry. I was the first female hire at our firm, and I'm usually the only woman in a boardroom, so it's something I personally really care about. So I think investors sit at a really important place in the ecosystem because we have influence over a lot of different things. Obviously the capital we deploy and the types of companies we fund, and the types of technologies they build. I think we have a role of influence in terms of where do our returns go. And so one of the things that we're thinking about is LP base. And how can you try to, all the wealth that's generated through venture, where does that go? And then we also think about our community. So for us, that means our portfolio companies, it means our broader core community, and then it means the broader Boston ecosystem, which also includes other venture firms. And then, of course, the fourth bucket that we think about is our team. and what are we doing about it? So we've actually laid out, we've formed an ESG committee. Our firm's only 14 people, but we have a committee. It's our only one, but it's one that we care about. So those are the four sort of vectors that we think about. Where do we have influence and what can we do about it? Obviously, I think one of the piece of where does capital go, there's a big piece of that is pipeline. And so trying to expand access to different pools of talent is something that we are actively seeking out. And then I also think, making ourselves more accessible as well. I think one of the challenges in venture is that a lot of decision making is based on pattern recognition, and patterns today have been backing certain types of founders and certain types of founders that look like other types of founders. And that's how, that's where some investment judgment comes in. So I think there's a couple things you can do about that. I mean, I do think bias training is really important and powerful. We actually just did our firm bias training this week, and it's an ongoing thing. I think creating access to I'm taking a lot more first meetings than I used to, and I think across our firm we were doing that sort of office hours to open up access in the pipeline. Tracking, just making sure that you measure what matters, or whatever that phrase is. So trying to make sure we're tracking increasing diversity in our pipeline and across our portfolio. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about on the capital side. I think for portfolio companies, access to talent is the biggest question that we get a lot. And I think sometimes for small companies who are trying to move fast, who don't have that much capital, it can become easy to try to make a trade-off of like, well, I need this hire right now, and this person is the right fit for it. And what I admire, and I think is an important practice, is committing to the diversity goals within your team, and committing to put in the extra effort to broaden your recruiting pipeline. And the unfortunate reality is that often takes longer and it takes more proactive work, but the teams that I've seen be successful in this just are really deeply committed to it. And so we are trying to do everything we can in terms of access to other types of resource to enhance that. So things like Hack Diversity here in Boston is a great program. Resilient Coders is another one. There's a lot of great organizations that are trying to increase access to diverse talent. So I think that's one of the biggest things in the portfolio companies that we're working with them on. I personally am involved with All Raise here in Boston, which is an organization that tries to support and promote female funders and founders. So I'm part of the leadership team here in Boston, and that's another good organization that is trying to increase access and networking. So it's a big topic, it's a hard topic, but it's an important one.
Sounds great. Darshana, Deepak, would you like to add to what Lily said?
Sure, I'll add a little bit. I agree with everything Lily said. A lot of what we do is very organic. And if you allow me, I'll just tell you a 1-minute story of a founder that I funded as part of Catalyst. But the reason I say I is because, when you have a woman on the investment team, then, more women feel more comfortable coming to you. And so back in 2012, I met this young woman who had no pedigree, no experience starting a company, was 23 years old and just had an idea for a device. And it was specifically a diagnostic device for ovarian cancer. So a woman founding a company to address a big unmet need in women's health. And she, by her own admission, now by the way, she's pretty famous, so has been interviewed in many different places, but back then had received 50 rejects from VCs across the US. And we decided to fund her in a seed round. Long story short, we funded her through 3 subsequent rounds, and we in 2018 sold the company to Boston Scientific for a very nice multiple. And the reason I tell this story is because, again, it's all organic. The more women that are on investment teams and the more women founders that are, the more the community grows. And so I find just because of my presence at Catalyst, we get a lot more diversity in terms of founders who come and seek capital from us. And the same thing is true for boards. I'd argue in 2011, when I first joined my first board, I was the only woman on the board. And today I would say 80% of my boards have at least 2 women on them. And why is that? Because I take my portfolio companies to other women VCs, when I'm networking with them, and then they get interested and invest. And so now you got this, increasing, just organically increasing number of women in this space. So that's my That's my contribution and our contribution. We don't have any specific programs, but I think the more women you have in investments, the more funding you'll see going to women founders.
Well said.
Yeah, what I would just so I thank you for sharing that, both of you, and I think I agree with Lily. I think your comment that this is a really hard problem, right? And how do you kind of increase that organic flow, and how do you make sure you get to see more companies, and then how do you make sure you don't have systematic biases at work that then put them in different buckets? And so I think we're certainly, I mean, we're a small team, we're 5 of us, and we do have 1 woman on the team. So we become cognizant of how we operate, how we decide, and when there are, when we see opportunities that are women-led or minority-led, we will force additional conversations to make sure we are really thinking through everything and not just, you know, applying systematic bias if that's at work. 2 of our companies do have women CEOs, but I think I can tell you that, I mean, every one of those investments that we made completely wins on the merits. And so, yes, they were women CEOs, but they're also bloody good, right? It's not as if there were any standards that were changed or compromised. And we've just made our first investment in a company where the CTO is a male but minority, and so again, it's happened and it's good, I think, but it wasn't, I mean, we didn't make any changes to our criteria in order to be able to make that investment. We're now in the process of hiring somebody into our fund, so we're adding 1 more person to our team, and again, it's all else being, you know, at the right level, we would prefer somebody that enhances our DEI, right? And so that's the approach we're taking. But I continue to feel that fine, that's okay as intent, but it's not good enough in terms of producing the kind of results we would want to see in the near term, and that's something we're still wrestling with.
Okay, great. I appreciate everybody's insight on this important topic. Simone, I think we're probably at a good spot now to open up to the audience for questions.
Great. So we have some great questions come through. So we have a question. Have any of the panelists invested in Canadian companies?
We
sorry,
go ahead.
companies,
but I don't think we've actually made an investment in a Canadian company, but we've looked at a lot of great companies coming out of Toronto. I think in particular, it's a great AI pool of talent that we're seeing some really interesting opportunities come out of there.
Yeah, we have just, we haven't closed yet, but we've just decided to invest in a company based out of Toronto, and we're in the process of closing. So this will be our first. And I referred to it earlier as outside of our usual kind of grazing grounds, which is Boston. And so this is the Toronto company.
We haven't. We've seen a lot of good companies out of Canada, but have been reluctant to go out of the US for now.
Thank you. What is the earliest stage of business you have typically invested in, and would you get involved in something that is in MVP development stage?
I'm happy to take a crack at it. I don't know if this is related to healthcare or medical devices. Yeah, we do. We have a pretty flexible investment strategy. We will look at, you know, everything has to stand up to its own merit, particularly, you know, relative to other companies that we're seeing and the amount of deal flow we have. But we, you know, as I just described in an example, there was a company we invested in. In fact, there were 2 or 3 where there wasn't even a prototype to look at. It was just an idea on paper, and we did that. Not always, it's not typical, but we will do that for compelling opportunities and compelling founders.
Yeah, I think that's true of us too. So what we're really looking for is how compelling is the problem being solved, and how interesting and unique is the way in which the problem is being solved. And of course, for us, there's always a big question of where's the AI, right? And I think AI is such a misused term these days, and it's slapped onto so many front doors. We really like to dig inside and understand kind of what's going on. So if we find good answers to these questions, and we think that the team combines domain expertise with the technical knowledge required, then we would take a view on that even before there are any market proof points.
Likewise, we look for a uniquely qualified team going after a really big problem. And we've written checks into individuals who have an idea that they're just noodling on. But if it's the right individual, who has a unique reason to be positioned to solve a big problem, then we would invest in that.
Great. And we'll close out with one final question. In regards to investment trends, what are you excited about in 2021?
I shared some. I'll let somebody else go first.
This one is not for me because we invest in medical devices. This is not like hot and sexy, or it's not Amazon or AI. It's therapeutic devices. But I'd let Deepak or Lily.
Yeah, well, I'll take a stab at one thing which may belong to some extent to your space, Darshana. One thing that we're seeing a fair amount of, and something that we're getting pretty excited about, is RPM, remote patient management, and the ability to collect data in real time. Initially, collect the data and report it whether for clinical trials or to doctors and patients or families of patients. But more and more, as you continue to collect that data, to be able to really draw inferences from that data and predictive inferences. And I talked to you earlier about this company called Encore. So in addition to actually correcting the tremor or addressing the tremor, it also tracks the tremors when they happen, what intensity, how long they last. If you think of combining that with clinical trials for Parkinson's medications, that can be quite interesting. Or if you think about that data being reported to physicians, that could be quite interesting. And so I think that's going to be an interesting space. And certainly with the developments in IoT and cloud and AI, and you put all that together into low-powered devices and wearables, that's a space we're excited about. There are others, but I just thought I'd call that one out.
I think I spoke to some of the ones we're excited about. I do think embedded finance into vertical applications, so different than the med tech digital health world, but I think we're going to see more and more of that, and there's some interesting opportunities that will be built there. I'm also increasingly excited about, Emergence had this term deskless workforce, but I think 80% of the employees in the world don't sit behind a desk. And so I think in terms of what technologies do they need to enable them to do their work better, faster, more efficiently, more collaboratively, and potentially remotely, I think there's still a lot of untapped opportunity there as well.